All right. Hello and welcome. Welcome to Greenlight Go's Community Practices. My name is Clark Friedrichs, and I'm speaking for the entire team at Greenlight Go. We are the partners of the US-based school, Strozzi Institute, which was founded by Richard Strozzi Heckler. And Richard developed this somatic methodology and has been training people from his dojo in Northern California. And he's been working at this for 40 years, a long time. So today we have a special guest, Pete Hamill. And Pete Hamill is a senior faculty member at the Strozzi Institute. He'll be talking today about embodied leadership and guiding us through a centering exercise as well. So that's going to be a real treat. Pete is a consultant, a facilitator, a writer, and a coach. He has lots of international experience in leadership and organizational development. He's written a book called Embodied Leadership, the Somatic Approach to Developing Your Leadership. He practices martial arts. He just told me jiu-jitsu. Is that right? And he enjoys traveling and reading all kinds of various things. He lives in the UK with his wife and daughter. And after Pete's talk and his centering exercise, we'll also have some time for questions and answers of that, and also anything you might want to know about the upcoming Embodied Leadership course in March, March 26th through 29th in Barcelona. Okay, and with that, thanks for being here, Pete, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Clark. So hello, everybody, and welcome. And nice to see some of you here on the screen and see some faces and be able to connect with you a little bit this evening. So what are we going to do today? Well, there's three kind of things that I want to do. I want to talk a little bit about this work and what it's about and give you a sense of an understanding of this work and what it is and why it works, basically. I'm going to share some examples based on the experience that I've had working with this. Some examples of how this works and what difference it can make. And then we're going to do some of it together. We're going to do a little bit. Where we've got not huge amounts of time, and we're working remotely, so we won't do that much, but we'll do a little bit. We'll start to have a little taste of this work and how does it work. And so that's the kind of aim of what I want to cover today. So if I start off and say a little bit about the work first. I think probably most of us have had the experience of, at some point in our lives, knowing that we should do something, wanting to do it, but somehow being unable to do it. There's something about that sort of sense of, I kind of know I should get up and go to the gym, or I kind of know I need to respond to conflict differently, or I kind of know I need to say no to some of these requests that keep coming at me, or hold my boundary with this person, or whatever it is. And so I know that. And I also want to do it. I mean, I really want to start saying no, or I really want to hold my boundary with this person, or I really want to respond to conflict differently. And yet somehow, despite knowing and despite wanting, being unable to do anything except for the habitual response that we have always done. Sometimes it's our family members that are best at evoking that kind of response to us. The parent says that thing to us that they say, and all of a sudden, boom, we're back to being, 8 years old again and responding as we've responded ever since. And so part of what we're looking at here is, how do we start to work with that? How do we start to make changes around that? How do we start to be able to move forward with that? Because underlying leadership, underlying coaching or human development, a lot of what underlies that are these basic patterns of response that we have. And some of them work for us and some of them don't. And we don't necessarily have full consciousness and self-awareness around all of them. But there's something about how do we make a change in some of those areas? How do we learn to do something different? And that's what the embodied work is about. It's about learning, how do I start to be able to develop the capacity to do something different? So we talk about this as embodiment, and there are certain things that we all embody. The things that we know how to do. And by embodiment, we mean kind of like I know how to do them without having to necessarily think about it. I can do it fairly consistently, and I can do it under pressure. So I can brush my teeth like that. I can drive a car like that. I couldn't always drive a car like that. The first time I got in the car and I was playing with gears and clutch and all of that, it was a mess. But I've developed the ability where I can do that without necessarily thinking about it. And so we've developed the ability to do all sorts of things without necessarily thinking about it. You know, our basic responses to conflict, most of us don't really have to think about. Response to being visible, holding boundaries, saying no, all of those basic things. We've learned those and we've gotten very, very good at them, and we repeat them over and over again. And we embody them. And so the question is, well, does what we embody move us towards what we care about? You know, as a leader, as somebody who is up to something in my life, does what I embody move me in the direction that I want to go? Because what I embody is probably perfect for the level of results that I'm getting in my life, in my leadership, in my relationships, in my parenting, in whatever domain of life that I'm concerned about. It's probably perfect for that level of results, but doesn't move me towards what I care about. And so when we look at the embodied work, what we're looking at is how do we learn to embody something different? And what's the process that we go through in order to embody something different? And, you know, that process of learning how to embody something different, what that means in this work is that I'm then able to do that the same way I can do whatever I'm doing at the moment, that I can do it without having to think about it, that I can do it when under pressure, that I can do it consistently. And so when we talk about embodied leadership programs, the level of learning that we are talking about is a level of learning where I can do something consistently that is different to what I could do before. And that's different to knowing about something. It's different to memorizing something. It's different to understanding a concept. You know, in the late 1990s, Daniel Goleman published, well, actually it was earlier than that, he published his seminal book on emotional intelligence. To the extent that today, I don't meet anybody in organizations who hasn't heard of the concept of emotional intelligence and doesn't know something about it. But do we really think we're living in a more emotionally intelligent world? Maybe in some places, but maybe not in others. So the knowing of that concept, the understanding of that concept, has not necessarily delivered a more emotionally intelligent world. So what we're interested in is that gap between knowing about and knowing how to, and how do we bridge that gap. And so our work within embodied leadership is specifically around understanding what are the gaps for me and how do I bridge those gaps in my life, in my leadership, in my relationships, in the work that I want to do, in the things that I want to achieve. So if we talk about embodiment and we talk about why it is we do what we do, then it's helpful to start to think about, well, you know, why is it that we habitually do take the actions that we take? Why is it that, you know, I kind of know that I should be saying no, but I don't, and I keep saying yes to things even though I don't really want to do them, and I always end up with that person who takes on the work that nobody else wants to do? Well, so, and in doing that, what we need to start to understand is that in taking on that work, what we need to address is there's a whole biological process that's going on rather than a cognitive one. And what I mean by that is whenever somebody comes into the room and asks me to do something and I know I need to say no, I feel a huge amount of visceral discomfort across my entire system, which causes me, in order to break the discomfort, to say yes, because that eases the tension and the discomfort of that moment. Or I'm sitting there there's a conflict starting to emerge within the team, and it's a conflict that the team really, really needs to have. And I know cognitively that they should really have this conflict and it would be really helpful for the team to resolve this issue. But because of my history, I have this massive visceral discomfort with conflict. And so what I do is I clamp it down and I contain it and I make everything okay and I appease and I just smooth it all out and make it go away. Because there's this massive sense of emotional discomfort that's starting to arise inside of me, which disables me from being able to take a different action. And so in order to calm down that visceral discomfort, I go and do what I've habitually done. The way that I learned to manage that discomfort probably the first time it occurred for me. So what we see is that there's a discomfort that arises in us, and we respond to that discomfort by making ourselves more comfortable. Now, this is just like, sometimes you kind of scratch your nose if you've got an itch. Yeah, it makes you more comfortable. But interestingly, sometimes you will notice that you're scratching your nose before you were fully conscious of the fact that you had an itch. Do you know that experience of kind of finding yourself, oh, okay, yeah, I was itchy there. So sometimes what happens is we're responding to the visceral discomfort before we're even fully aware of it. We are making ourselves more comfortable before we're fully present to the discomfort that's arisen inside of us. And so we're channeling back into whatever habitual patterns of behavior that we have before we're fully aware of the moment and before we have the capacity to make a choice to do something different. And arguably, we can understand most of our personality in that way. We can understand, there are a whole series of cultural rules that we adhere to, because we'll feel viscerally discomfort if we step into doing something else. So if you go and live in another culture for a while, as many of us have, what you'll notice is that there's a whole series of things which feel viscerally uncomfortable and which feel weird and different, and you kind of have to try to adapt yourself into a new culture and find another new way of doing things. I live in England, so the English are very, very good at queuing. But for an English person to skip a queue is a very difficult thing to do. And if they try to do that, they will feel viscerally uncomfortable doing it, because they will have to barge in ahead of the queue, ahead of other people, and they will, it will feel a painful thing to do. So we're held, our personality, our culture, all the things we've learned are held in place by this process, which keeps us in this safe pattern of behavior. And for some of us, it's very comfortable at a party to stand up on a table and dance, and for some of us, it isn't. Yeah, for some of us, that would feel viscerally uncomfortable to do that. For some of us, it'll be very comfortable to do that. Again, our personality is held in place by these, neuroscientists call them somatic markers, these bits of our history which play out for us and which keep us in this sort of pattern of behavior. And so what we see is that we're responding to what's going on inside of our body. And we're responding to what's going on there before we've had a chance to really consciously think about it. Before we've often had a chance for it to fully come to awareness. It's in the pre-conscious, it's not in the fully conscious yet. It's in that area before consciousness. And we're already reacting to it, making ourselves more comfortable by playing out an habitual pattern of behavior. Doing something that we've learned to do historically. Okay? And so part of what we're looking at then is the first piece of our work in this field is to start to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. To allow ourselves to be aware of and be present to those moments of visceral discomfort as they arise inside of us, and be with them rather than being in reaction to them. And so the very first piece of this work is turning to face, and is turning to face ourselves and the discomfort that arises. And in doing so, we're also facing whatever piece of our history that's caused us to have that visceral discomfort. So I learned to be uncomfortable in conflict because this is what happened in my family, and I learned that this was bad and wrong or whatever. And so we need to turn and face that. Or I had this experience in life which caused me to be uncomfortable being visible. Maybe it was at school, maybe it was in, whatever situation. But, being visible, being the center of attention is now massively viscerally uncomfortable for me. And so we've got to turn and face that internalized discomfort. We've got to turn and face the emotions that sit with that. So the first move we make in this work is a turning to face and a learning to be with. Being with that discomfort as it arises without being in reaction to it. The next move we have to make is to learn to be able to take new moves in life. So I worked with a guy who's HR director of a big company. And he was one of those guys who, had, as many men in our culture are, who have been taught that big boys don't cry, that to man up, to kind of hold and contain his emotions, to be tough and all of that kind of stuff. And what that meant was that for him, because he couldn't be comfortable with his own emotions, he wasn't able to be comfortable with anybody else's emotions. So when somebody started to get emotional because he was having performance conversations, or he was having to make them redundant, or whatever it was that was going on in the organization, when they got emotional, he would kind of tap them on the shoulder on the way out of the room, saying, "I'll just give you a minute." And he told himself that the reason that he was doing that was because it was better for them, that it gave them some space and time, and that that was really what they needed in that instance. And the truth was, of course, that he was doing it for him, because being with somebody else, being emotional, evoked all of his visceral discomfort about emotions. And if you can't be with your own emotions, then you can't be with somebody else and their emotions, and you can't empathize. So he was unable to empathize with people who were going through a range of different experiences. So his first work was to face that internalized emotion, or that internalized fear of his own emotions. And his next piece of work was then to learn to empathize with people, because he'd never done that, because he couldn't be in touch with his own emotions. And of course, to learn to empathize with a 50-year-old man versus a 20-year-old woman is different. Different people require different things from us based on gender, age, nationality, background, working class, whatever. There's all sorts of things. And so he had to learn the skills of being empathetic and the skills of engaging with people from that type of place. So the first move of this work is to face and to be with. And then the second move is to start to learn what are the practices that will allow me to be able to cultivate a different capacity in life. And for his case, this was emotions. It's really important, because one of the things that this story brings up is the idea that when we do something compulsively in this way, even though we don't consciously think about it, we're responding to that visceral discomfort, we will always make up a story to rationalize why we've done what we've done. Yeah? So it's post-rationalization. Psychologists have been telling us for years that we post-rationalize most of our behavior. And so, there's this sense, you see people, for example, in networking events, and there's a whole bunch of people who are kind of around the edge of the networking event on their phones, kind of checking it out and seeing if it's safe, basically, and dealing with the discomfort of that kind of social pressure and social anxiety by doing emails. And if you ask them why they're doing what they're doing, they'll have an important email they need to deal with. That will be the post-rationalization. And I'm not saying they're making up a story because they're lying to us. It's a post-rationalization. They will, at some level, will believe it. And we always have important emails that we need to deal with. We can always find a reason to kind of hang out at the edges and not participate. But what's really going on is they're managing the visceral discomfort of that kind of social environment. And so part of what we see in life is that this is a way of understanding who we are in the world. That a lot of our behaviors, a lot of our personality is a series of things that we do that we've already embodied, that we don't need to think about. We don't wake up in the morning and think, how do I be me? I kind of know how to do that. But all of those aspects of personality are held in place by these somatic markers. And that's why people will say, oh, I don't really do that. That's not me. That's not the type of person I am. That doesn't feel right for me. It doesn't feel comfortable for me. That's what they're expressing. They're expressing the somatic markers that hold in place their personality, that hold in place those patterns of behavior. And that's, there's no moral reason to change this or do anything about it. But the question that we come to is that sufficient to get you what you care about? Is that sufficient for the leadership that you want to express, for the life that you want to lead, for the relationships that you want to have, for the family, for the community, for the environment that you want to be in? Is it sufficient? And if not, then what kind of work needs to happen? Who do you need to be in order to deliver on what you care about? And how do we start to cultivate a self that can deliver on what you care about? And that's really what this work is about. There's a whole host of self-awareness that comes through this work. Huge amount of self-awareness that comes through this work. But we don't stop at self-awareness, because there's a way in which, you know, I meet people all the time who kind of get addicted to self-awareness. It's like that next moment of insight, of the self-awareness, of cognitive insight of, oh, wow, that's what I do, and this is why I do it. And it's a bit of a high, really, that we can get from that. But there's also the work that we need to do, which is to take that to the next level, which is, how do I cultivate the ability to do something else in the world? How do I cultivate the ability to be able to empathize in the case of that HR director? So I've already talked to some degree about this is embodied or somatic, but I want to talk a little bit more about why we reference or why we think about the physical body in this. Because that's what somatic is about. It's about the living body in its wholeness. It's about the how do we work with that? And I've talked a little bit about the idea that this visceral discomfort arises in the body. It arises below the chin. We experience it at that level. But not only does it do that, our reactions to it also occur below the chin. So what I mean by that is that conflict occurs, and I withdraw from conflict. I kind of, you know, I find myself withdrawing or backing away from conflict. That's not just a cognitive process of withdrawal. It's not just an emotional process of withdrawal. If you watch somebody who withdraws from conflict, they withdraw from conflict. They make themselves small. They retract. They retreat. They physically remove themselves. And if you watch a team around a board table and they're kind of having some conflict, you will see people do that. So the practices that we take on are not cognitive or emotional practices. They are somatic practices. They are embodied practices, embodied responses. If you talk about the guy, you know, the HR director who hasn't cried in, 40 years because he's been told to repress emotions. Well, how do you stop yourself crying? It's very simple. You tighten on the diaphragm. You bring the breathing up into the upper chest. You tighten around the jaw and throat, and you tighten around the eyes. And this does two things for us. It stops the physical expression of the emotion. It stops the release of that emotion. But because of the tightening and the contracting of the muscles and the tension that we hold, it limits the flow of blood and hormones to the tissues, which limits the degree to which we experience and feel the emotion. So anybody that wants to stop themselves crying, they do those basic movements, probably without thinking about it. And if you meet somebody who hasn't cried in 40 years, you can talk about that kind of cognitively and therapeutically as a repression of emotions or something like that. Or you can say that they've just got a long-term pattern of tightening the diaphragm, shallow breathing, tightening around the jaw and throat and the eyes. And you get them to relax those places, and all of a sudden they'll feel sad. And then they'll tighten right back up again because they'll panic because they don't like feeling sad. It's held physically. And so all of our personalities are held this way, which is why you'll walk down the street sometimes and you'll pass somebody and you'll get a sense of them as shy, or aggressive, arrogant. It's why we'll get that sense of people as we engage with them, because it's held physically. It's held in the muscular contractions, and that's how we hold our personalities. And when we start to release and work with those muscular contractions, what we start to see is that something else starts to emerge. New possibilities for action start to emerge. If I'm the kind of person who can't hold boundaries, there's a shape associated with that. Once I start to change my shape, all of a sudden the new possibility of saying no and holding my boundaries with other people in relationship becomes a possibility for me. And so as we work with the physicality, we're not just working with physicality. The essence of this work is that the physicality, the emotional, the cognitive, it's one process just felt and experienced at 3 different levels. And we're working with that one process through the body. Because the body is in some way a very operational place to work with it. because we can physically relax, we can change things, we can do things much easier than we can think ourselves into a new way of thinking or think ourselves into a new way of feeling. But we can do things operationally with our body that start to create a different mood, a different set of emotions, a different set of possibilities for action, and a different set of thoughts. And so that's part of the essence of what we're doing here. We're really starting to work with how do we create transformation of the self? How do we move from a place of, I kind of know I'm not very good at this, and I can't really deal with conflict well, or I can't really hold my boundaries well, or whatever it is, to a place of, I embody the capacity to do that. I know how to do that well enough that actually people wouldn't know that that was difficult for me 5-10 years ago, because I do it so well that they can't see that. That's the journey of transformation that we go on with this work. So I'll give you an example of a client I was working with. This was an audit partner in a big professional services firm. And he was managing his first global client relationship, global lead client partner on this relationship. And the chief financial officer of the client was a bit of a bully who shouted and swore and slammed the table and slammed doors and all of this kind of stuff. And this partner was probably the most conflict averse person you've ever met. He was an accountant by training, and if you'd seen him in action, you would have thought he was probably an accountant, if you know what I mean. He embodied that aspect of being an accountant, and he couldn't handle conflict. It was the worst thing in the world for him. But this was his first global relationship that he was managing, and he had a team of people sitting behind him, metaphorically speaking, who were expecting him to front up to the client and hold boundaries and say to the client what's acceptable and what's not, and what we are going to do and what we're not going to do, and be in those types of conversations. And all he wanted to do was kind of in those moments was crawl out of the room backwards. I mean, he got smaller and smaller in his seat, and he diminished himself, and his voice got lower, and he was less, he really wasn't able to handle that. And so our journey of working together was a journey of starting to uncover, how is it that he does what he does? So the starting point for us wasn't why, it was how. How do you do what you do in response to conflict? What happens for you? From the physical, the emotional, the mental. How does he observe what's going on in those situations? And starting to observe the way he was diminishing himself, starting to observe what was happening to his breathing and his voice, holding his breath, becoming very shallow, his voice becoming very high-pitched as a result. Starting to observe the way the volume was going down, starting to observe the way he was losing eye contact with the client, starting to observe the emotional process that he was experiencing, the fear that was going on for him, and starting to observe actually some of the memories and the stories that started to come back for him in those moments. And again, this was something that, beforehand he wouldn't have been able to tell me, but in observing it, he was able to start to see, oh, this is evoking a memory of when I was a child, and my parents had a row, and this is what happened. And so there was a kind of sense in which he was able to start to see that at that level, that moment was going through his head every time in this situation. That every time he was stuck in this situation of, I've done something wrong. That every time that the emotional thing was shame and fear, and that the physical thing every time was exactly the same pattern of behavior, exactly the same pattern of withdrawal, of breathing, of voice, of eye contact. He was able to see all of that. And then when we start to do that work, we start to get to the place of what is it to learn to be able to center ourselves in that feeling, in that fear, in that shame, in all of that stuff that was coming up for him. What was it to center and to be able to be with it without reacting to it? And that's the centering practice that we'll get to a little later, is a practice of being with whatever is, but without being in reaction to it. And so we had we had a period of time which was just seeing and observing this whole pattern and practicing being with it without reacting to it. And from there, we started to move into a place where it was practicing a different response. So he worked in London and he took a lot of black taxis in London. And anybody who's taken a taxi in London will know that the taxi drivers often strike up a conversation with you about the events of the day. And so his job was to disagree with the taxi driver for the length of the cab journey. Doesn't matter what he actually believed, but he had to disagree. He had to be in a practice of disagreeing while remaining centered. So he had to center himself, and then in the moment of disagreeing and then freaking out about the fact that he was disagreeing, recenter, and go through a continual practice of centering and recentering, and hold the tension of being in disagreement for the length of the taxi ride. And it was a way of practicing a different way of being in conflict without consequence. Because, you know, here it was, there was no, this wasn't with his big client. This wasn't a situation where he was trying something out with you know, that had massive consequence to it that could affect the rest of his career. This was a safe, contained experience where he could try something out and try it out and see what worked and see what he could learn to do and what he could learn about this process. And so we worked with that for a period of time. And then we moved from there into a process where he then started to bring that more and more into his working life and more into the conversations that he was having with his client. And so I worked with him for, I guess, about 10 months on this process to get to a place of being comfortable, of being in a series of practices so that he could be comfortable being in conflict. And I met him a couple of years later, and he was handing over the client to someone else. And he just handed it over. And as part of that, they'd gone to a meeting together to transition the client. And the chief financial officer had done his thing of shouting and screaming and, you know, doing his usual thing. And the other partner who was taking over the account said to him afterwards, gave him the feedback afterwards, that, wow, you handled that really, really well. I wish I could be as good at dealing with conflict as you are. So I say that just so you have a sense of that's the journey of transformation that's possible when we go down an embodied route. Because what gets in the way of us, you know, we can approach conflict from kind of like a cognitive perspective and start to understand the styles of people in conflict together. But in the moment, when my entire psychobiology is freaking out because my entire history of conflict is that this is scary and dangerous, that styles of conflict matters nothing. Do you know what I mean? That moment, it matters not at all. What matters is what do I have the capacity in the moment to do? And that involves dealing with our whole psychobiology and the fact that we're freaking out whenever we're in a conflict situation. So that's the journey of transformation that we do in this work, is that journey of dealing with the underlying psychobiology and what's going on inside of that inside of any type of situation where we are triggered into an historical set of patterns and behaviors in service of whatever we care about as a leader or in living our life, for our communities, for our families, for our teams, for our organizations, whatever that is. So in service of that, in service of those results. So I've talked a little bit about practices, and I want to say a little bit more about that before we get into our first practice, and we do a practice together. And so practices, there are three things that we say about practices in this work. The first thing is you're always practicing something. The second thing is we are what we practice. And then the third thing is what you're practicing moving you towards what you care about? Is it aligned towards what you care about? So, first one, we're always practicing. Right now, you're practicing a whole series of things. You're practicing a way of listening on webinars. Yeah, some people will have a way of listening that is very open and uncritical. Some people will have a way of listening that is very critical, and some might even say skeptical or cynical. So that is often below the surface of attention. but it is a way of there's a way of listening that we will practice, that we will bring to these types of situations. There's no good, bad, right or wrong here. It's just going, we are in a way of listening. We are practicing a way of listening. We are practicing a way of bringing our attention forward while on a webinar, on a virtual call. So for some of us, that involves having the camera on. For some of us, it involves having it off. For some of us, we might be trying to multitask while doing that and paying attention to emails or other things coming in. So we'll be practicing a way of engaging. We're practicing a way of sitting. We're practicing a way of managing our own attention. I'm practicing a way of trying to reach out and connect with people across the virtual sphere. So we're all practicing different things. And we're all practicing different things all the time. As we go through our lives, we're practicing different ways of holding ourselves, different ways of engaging with people, different ways of doing everything that we do. So we're kind of incapable of not practicing. So the way that we have of seeing ourselves and seeing ourselves in the world is that we are constantly engaged in practices. They are social practices, they are cultural practices, they are individual practices, but we're constantly in practice. And that those practices, the sum of those practices give us who we are in the world, which was our second contention. We are what we practice. You know, if I practice a certain way of engaging with conflict, that will give me a certain identity in the world. If I practice a certain way of holding myself, that will give me a certain identity in the world. If I practice a way of listening, that will give me a certain identity in the world. I don't know, many of us will have probably had the experiences of bosses or people that we've gone to see who have that way of listening, which is, yeah, go on ahead, I'm just typing away here, don't go on ahead, and that's the way of listening. And that gives us a certain identity in the world. Gives us a certain level of understanding of other people as well when we practice that way of listening. So we are what we practice. You know, from the practice of the tension of the holding of the diaphragm and the shallow breathing and the clenching around the jaw and the eyes, which gives us that lack of emotional experience. That's a series of practices that give us a way of being in the world. When we constantly detach from ourselves, detach from our felt sense of being in the world, that gives us another way of being in the world. Yeah, it gives us a way of being able to take action in the world. You know, we don't do harm to other people at a physical, emotional, or whatever way, unless at some level we're disconnecting from some part of ourselves. We have to do that in order to be able to engage in that kind of harm. So there's a way of being in the world that we can practice that gives us certain possibilities and that closes off others. And so all of these things that we're practicing give us who we are. And so that's the second contention about practices, is that practices give us who we are in the world. And then the third contention about practicing, or the third thing that we say about practices in this work, is, are your practices aligned to what you care about? Are they actually moving you in the direction of your concerns? You know, there's a whole group of people in the world who will say that they're concerned about various things and they care about certain things and they want to make a difference here, but their practices are moving them in a very different direction. And it's not out of maliciousness or malintent or anything like that. It's that there's an invisibility of the alignment between practices and what we care about. There's an invisibility of that at times. So part of what we're looking at here is, how do we start to bring our practices in line with what we care about, in line with what we're committed to, and make sure that they're lined up and that they're moving us in a consistent direction. So that's what we mean by practices in this work. Is we're seeing the world through the lens of practices, that we're always in practices, that we embody a series of practices that gives us who we are in the world. And that there's the question for us to all to answer is that sense of an alignment between our practices and what we care about. So I'm going to move us into a practice, but before we do, I just wanted to check if there were any questions. Okay, well then let's do something together. So I'm going to invite you, if you can, to stand up. I'm aware that there's a virtual version of this that people can listen to later, so they may be in all sorts of situations as they do that, and it may not be possible where you are at this moment. But if you can, stand up. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the first practice of this work, which is a centering practice. And in doing this, what we're looking at doing is we're looking at creating that space where we can experience whatever's going on for us without being in reaction to it. Yeah, it's that place where we can feel our emotions and have our emotions rather than being had by them. And it's the first basic practice of this. And we do it standing up because when we're standing up, we have a greater sensory awareness inside of our body. We'll have greater awareness of what's going on. We can do it sitting down by all means, and we can talk about that later if you like, but we'll do it standing up in this instance because that gives us a greater awareness of what's going on inside of our systems. So first thing to do inside of this is we're standing with our hands by our side and our feet about shoulder width apart. And just let your attention drop down out of your head for a moment and allow your attention to drop down inside your body. Dropping down out of the thinking self into the feeling self. And feel and notice whatever's going on for you today. Maybe some aches and pains, maybe some, maybe coldness, heat, whatever it is, just notice what's there for you at this moment. And then we're going to center ourselves in 3 domains. And we're going to start off by centering ourselves in the domain of length. And length, what we mean by that is if you can imagine somebody's putting on a hair on the top of your head and just stretching you out so that you rise from something like this to something like that. Almost like you're putting some air between your vertebrae and standing fully in your length. And at the same time as standing up and allowing yourself to fully inhabit your length, we're also relaxing down. So we don't need to hold up our shoulders or clamp our jaw. We don't need to hold our stomach or project our chest. None of that. We can just relax all of those different places. So we're extending up and relaxing down, letting gravity do its work. We refer to length in this work as the domain of dignity. And we call it the domain of dignity because if you have ever seen dancers on stage, they often have perfect posture. And we often ascribe dignity to that. It looks very dignified. And what we also know is that the first thing that happens to somebody when you do something that takes away their dignity is they collapse in length. So there's something about how do we hold ourselves with dignity? Because if we don't hold ourselves with dignity, how do we expect other people to hold us with dignity? So there's something about allowing ourselves to live and stand fully in our human dignity. Second domain that we work with is the domain of width. So the first thing we want to do is get our balance left to right. Find that place where our weight is equally balanced between the left and the right. And then what I'd invite you to do is to take a deep breath and allow yourself to fill up from the inside, but left to right. Allow yourself to take up the space left to right that you're due in the world. To be visible. And allow yourself just to fill out. Allow your rib cage to meet its own boundaries. There's a whole group of people in the world who hold themselves in like this, tight, who keep themselves very narrow in the world. And when we do that, we're inviting people into our boundaries. We're inviting people in. And when we invite people in, they tend to push on our boundaries. So there's a real correlation that we see with being able to show up in the domain of width and being able to hold our boundaries in life. Being able to say no, being able to hold ourselves in relationship with other people in an appropriate way. So part of what we're learning to do is to hold ourselves in width inside of our own boundaries, to take up space and be visible. Finally, we have the domain of depth. So in the domain of depth, what we know is that as human beings, the majority of the sense organs are at the front of our body. We have a tendency to orient as the future ahead of us and the past behind us. You know, and so there's a whole group of people, and we see them in the world, who kind of can't get there fast enough. You know, you see them driving, they're kind of leaning over the steering wheel, can't quite get there fast enough, moving as fast as they can through life. And then there's a whole other group of people who are leaning away from the world. It's like it's coming at me a bit too fast, and kind of lean away. You know, they kind of say, nice to meet you, and they lean away at the same time, and you wonder, is it nice to meet me? And so what we're looking at here is finding that place where we're not leaning away, not in the past, not getting into the future, but bringing ourselves into the present, balancing our weight between the heels and the balls of our feet so that we allow ourselves to come into the present moment. So just see if you can find that place for yourself. So we're centering in length, we're centering in width, and we're centering in depth, the three spatial domains that we live in. Next thing is just to take a deep breath down into your stomach. And a nice long exhale. And then bring your attention to the body's physical center of gravity. So our center is about 1 inch or 2 below the navel. Point below, just below the navel. It's sometimes helpful just to bring your hand there. So if you can imagine, if you put your thumb on your belly button, then your hand will kind of be resting on your navel or on your center. And just create a bit of sensation there, because what we want you to do is to bring your attention there so you feel from that place. I'm not wanting to think about it as an abstract concept, but really feel from that place. It's your center of gravity. In many traditions, it has different names, the Hara in the Japanese tradition. But just feel from that place and let your hand drop away, but keep your attention there. And I just invite you to notice what there is to notice in this place. Just notice what there is. Notice what is present, notice what isn't present. And how do you experience yourself at this moment? And then Clark, could you do me a favor and take people off mute? Don't know if there's a way to do that, just take everybody off.
I'm not finding there it is.
Cool. So I invite you, you're not all off mute, so I invite you in a word or two to say something about what you notice in this centered space. What do you notice or what do you experience?
Grounded, being grounded, I think is a word that comes to me.
Lovely, a groundedness. Thank you.
I feel present.
Yeah, present, lovely, thank you.
Peace, being at peace.
Being at peace, thank you, Carmen.
Oh.
For me, it was grounded.
Grounded as well, somebody else was grounded.
Present and
Intention is
Present and something else, I didn't hear the other one was.
receptive.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else, what do you notice?
Lightness.
Lightness.
It's a conscious of being here.
Consciousness of being here. Yeah, thank you.
I feel where the tension is.
Yeah, so an enhanced awareness of where do you feel tense and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, nice. So often what people experience when we're doing it in a scenario like this, where we're kind of slightly disconnected from the world, if you like, where we're kind of in a different space together, often what people experience will often have an element of calmness to it. But it's not necessarily always going to produce calmness. It's not like a Zen pill where I get to bliss out or whatever. If I'm grieving and I center myself, I will experience my grief. If I'm angry and I center myself, I will experience my anger. But the piece that is available to us here is that we have the capacity to be in that emotion, but without being in reaction to that emotion. So I'm not stuck in a place of enacting my anger. I have choice about what I do with it. I have choice about what I do in terms of that experience that I have in this moment. So when I talked earlier about the aspect of turning and facing, the internal turning and facing whatever is going on for ourselves, this is part of what we need to do, is we need to learn to center and face whatever it is that's going on with us as part of this. This is part of the action of doing that, or this is the action of doing that. And so from this place, when we center ourselves, it gives us the capacity then to choose a different response. Anything else that anybody noticed in doing this? Okay, so let's sit down.
Mute people.
Yeah, why not? Thank you. So the other thing that it is there for centering.
Oh, wait, not you.
So sorry about that. The other thing about centering is that centering is a practice. What I mean by that is it's not like I center myself and I stay there. It's I center myself and then the world happens and then I have to center myself again. The centering is part of the martial arts, comes from the Japanese martial arts tradition. Although versions of it basically apply across all martial arts to some degree. And the reason why is that when you put yourself on the mat in a martial arts context, someone's going to try to hit you. And when someone tries to hit you, your basic response will come out. You will see, there's no better way to see your basic response to conflict than to have someone try to hit you, because it will come out at some level. And then what you need to do is you need to overcome that, to center yourself and to be able to learn a different way of responding. And so it has that kind of, it has some of that history to it. And Morohayo Shiba, who was the founder of the Japanese martial art of Aikido, was once asked by one of his students how it was that he remained so centered all the time. And his response was to say he wasn't. He just came back to center before they'd noticed. And that's kind of the game. The game is, how do we get so good at centering that we're in the middle of a situation, conflict breaks out, or somebody says that thing, you know, that thing that tweaks us, that kind of gets under our skin. Somebody says that to us. And all of a sudden we have the capacity to respond, to center ourselves before they've noticed that we've gone. Now, we don't get there overnight. That takes practice. That takes a period of time of consciously practicing centering ourselves so that we can get very quick at it and that we can know, you know, where are the places that I habitually hold tension that I need to relax, that are specific to me. The places where I kind of contract and I hold myself. And also so that I get very, very clear and aware of my triggers and how they live inside of me, how they live in my body. So that the instant they occur, I can center myself and respond however I choose to respond, rather than engaging whatever habitual reaction, or even letting the other person see that I've been tweaked. So that's kind of the long-term game, is how good can I get at this, is how quickly can I respond? Can people start to not notice that actually I was triggered by something because I centered and I was able to recover and move into the situation and address it and deal with it? So that's kind of, when we talk about centering, it's a practice rather than a state that we go into and try to keep. And when we get into this work, part of what we do is we start to look at getting very clear about where is it that we go when we get knocked off center. Because each of us has our patterns. And they're pretty unique to us. But one of the interesting things that we tend to find is that we pretty much go to the same place every time. We have the same set of physical responses, the same set of emotional responses, the same set of cognitive responses. And, you know, maybe not 100% of the time, but kind of 90% of the time, they'll be pretty much the same. And they'll have enough repeatability and enough similarity that getting to know them really well gives me a lot of operational control over, if I know how I do that, then I can know how to do something different. I know how to interrupt it, and I know how to do something different. So we spend a good chunk of time in this work learning, where is it that I go when I get put under pressure? When someone comes along and tweaks me, where are my patterns? Where do I get taken? And how can I deepen my understanding of this? So there's a period of this work which is almost like being an anthropologist on ourselves and starting to really see and observe, oh wow, every time this happens, it's the same response. And I started to notice more nuances of it. Like I really contract my arms when that happens, and I didn't realize I was doing that. I get layers and layers of depth of what are those basic responses that I'm in. And the more layers of depth that I get, the more clarity I have about how I can start to do something different in that moment. So we spend a lot of time as anthropologists studying ourselves and seeing those patterns, seeing those behaviors. And we spend some time learning, what is it to do something different? What is it for us to interrupt that process with centering, to face whatever we need to face in that process, and then to step into doing something different, to step into a different set of actions and a different set of possibilities, and learn to be able to take those actions so that they're natural, so that we embody those responses. And in doing that, we kind of go through a bit of an opening up process where we, you know, if you really, in everything that I've said today, you know, if you really start to see that we are what we practice, and that when we start to interrupt those practices and see that they're connected to pieces of our history, and we start to practice something different, that actually there's a big opening up that happens of ourselves, where all of a sudden we can start to feel and experience different capacity, different aspects of ourselves. You know, our body is the first point of reference we have for how we experience ourselves and how we experience the world. You know, it's, do I feel confident today? Do I feel good? Does this feel like a safe environment? All of that stuff, our body is the point of reference for that. And when we start to change the practices and we start to change how we hold ourselves, all of a sudden we start to experience new moods, new emotions, new capacities for action. And we have this opening moment where all of a sudden we wake up one day and somehow it doesn't feel quite the same being us as it did yesterday. It feels a little bit different. Because inside of ourselves, what was familiar is no longer there. And something new is starting to come to form. And so as we do this work, there's a real transformative opening that occurs for us where we move out of that habitual patterns of behaviors, out of that habitual felt sense of how we experience ourselves and how we experience the world, and something new starts to emerge, where we have different possibilities for action. And when we do that, all of a sudden, new actions become common sense. You know, it's like if you've ever tried to talk to somebody about, you know, they're having difficulty at work, and you say to them, you know, why don't you give the person that feedback? And they say, oh, no, can't do that. Or, you know, I absolutely can't, or I've done that, and no, they don't listen. They're blah, blah, blah. And they have all of these reasons and all of these things inside of which it absolutely does not make sense to have another conversation with this person. It absolutely does not make sense. But all of a sudden, as we open this up, we start to develop new capacities in ourselves, all of a sudden new things start to make common sense. You know, the series of practices that are embodied make having that conversation the last thing that makes common sense. And when we start to develop a whole series of new practices, all of a sudden new things become common sense. New things become obvious. Oh, it's just obvious. Of course I'm going to have the conversation with that person. Or of course I'm going to do this. Or of course I'm going to say no to that piece of work. in a way that was unavailable to us before, things start to show up for us in a very different way. The world appears different. The world affords us different possibilities for taking action than it did appear to before, because we are different. We are different actors in the world. And so that's what makes this work quite transformative. It makes it transformative when we move through that opening place and all of a sudden new possibilities start to appear for us like common sense. They start to appear for us like, oh yeah, no, but I can do that, as opposed to, oh no, I can never do that. I'm not that type of person, or that person would never listen to me, or whatever it is. We start to see some different things. And so that's the essence of this work. The essence of this work is getting to the place where new actions become common sense and we embody the capacity to take them. And it's a bit like, you know, I remember there's a great Northern Irish, I'm from Northern Ireland originally. There's a great Northern Irish footballer called George Best. Some of you may be familiar with. He was very famous, no longer alive now, but he was very famous for a lot of years. And he just had this skill. And I remember seeing him in this football match, and he got in the corner and he had 3 players, I think, around him. And, you know, as I looked at the situation, it was obvious to me that what he needed to do was kind of kick the ball off one of their legs and hope for a corner or a throw in, or chip it over their heads to somebody else. But George Best, being George Best, saw the possibility of taking the ball around everybody and scoring a goal. But the interesting thing for me is, like, for me, I'm hopeless at football. I couldn't see that as a possibility. It was utterly invisible to me that there was a way of doing that, in a way that was utterly visible to him. And the practices that we've developed, give us our capacity to see possibilities for action in the world. And so when we embody different practices, all of a sudden we look at the world and we see different possibilities for action. We see different possibilities for engaging with situations, with people, with conflict, with challenges, with whatever it is. We just see different possibilities for taking action. And that's the process that we will go through when we're working in an embodied way. And when we do this work at Strozzi Institute, we do this work with individuals as leaders. We do this work and we train coaches to be somatic coaches so that they can bring this work to people as a coach. We do this with teams, and we look at what are the team's patterns and contractions that they habitually hold as a team, what possibilities for action are available for that team, and how can they start to shift negative moods that are held within the team, etc. We do it with organizations. But the essence of it is always the same, is what are the practices that we're in? What is it that we embody the capacity to do? And what new practices do we need to be in to embody something else so that we can take different actions? Okay, so I've been talking for quite a while now. So what I'd like to do is open it up and leave some space for some questions. And anything that I've said that sparked anything in your head, or that's caused you to be curious, or that I haven't explained very well, please do come in and ask a question, and I will endeavor to clarify or answer that question. You'll have to unmute yourself to do that. Wow. So maybe I've explained it really, really well, or everybody's gone to sleep. I don't know. Okay, so assuming that I've explained it well. Oh, somebody's saying we cannot unmute ourselves. Let's see. I have unmuted you.
Thank you. Great. Hi, Pete. Thanks so much for the webinar. I really appreciated that very much.
No worries.
I trained last year as an embodied facilitator with Mark Walsh in the UK, so I know the work from that angle, and I came tonight because I really wanted to hear perspective from the Strozzi Institute and learn more about how the work is articulated, in the language of the Strauss Institute, and I really loved it. It was great. My question is about this important component in the approach, which is linking it to what you care about.
Mhm.
And so for me, while a lot of the system or the approach that you've described are very clear, the concept of care, or that question of what you care about, remains still a little bit of a black box. I was wondering if you could say more about, do you also have ways of locating that in the body, or where does care live in this? Does the question make sense to you?
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely. And it's a brilliant question, because, of course, depending on our level of disconnection from ourselves and our bodies, we may or may not know what we care about.
Yeah, exactly.
And our emotions tell us what we care about. And if we've spent a long period of time disconnecting ourselves from either all or part of our emotions, then the capacity to have a clear sense of what I care about is often challenging.
Yeah.
So often that's a journey for people. And so one of the things that we do inside of this work is that we ask that as a question that we get people to consider before they come to the programs. And we work on it for a long time in the programs, because often if I kind of approach that from a cognitive intellectual level, many people will tell me what their parents thought they should have cared about, or what they think they should care about, or something like that. There'll be some version of it which is at a distance from what it is what's truly important and what's living and what's vital. And so what we do is we spend a whole period of time deepening our understanding of that, and deepening our understanding of where does that live inside the body. And the wonderful place that we get to is a place when somebody speaks what they're committed to. We call it a declaration in this work. But when they speak what they're committed to in such a way where they themselves are touched by it. And when they do that, if you're a good, committed listener in that conversation, you yourself will be touched by it. And what I mean by that is that moment where somebody says something and the hairs on the back of your neck kind of stand up, and you have that sort of slight tingling. That's the place for me that we're always kind of edging towards. Now, some people will kind of have dramatic moves in that direction. Some people will be much more subtle. But you're looking for that place where somebody says something where all of a sudden it's coming from deep down inside of here. It's like, oh yeah, you said something and it meant something to you.
Yeah.
Because when you do that, when somebody speaks it from a place of it really means something to me, it touches you. So, I mean, I had a coaching client once who I worked with him for a couple of years on and off. And his starting point with me was he wanted to basically get the next promotion. He wanted to get the bigger company car. He spent his weekends on property websites looking at the properties in the surrounding area, and was thinking about the next property that he wanted to buy. And so it was very much focused around that. But, you know, there was some kind of big aspects in terms of his leadership, and he was willing to work in this way. So we did some work together. And in doing some work together, he worked in a steel plant. And I don't know if you know, it's heavy industry, steel plant. The steel industry kills a certain number of people every year, just in industrial accidents. There's health and safety issues, that kind of stuff. So it's a difficult industry. And one day, after we were working together for a period of time, and he was deepening his connection to his emotions and his sense of himself, he had the realization one day that he would not be happy to have his son work on his steel plant. It was like this moment of, oh shit, I would not be okay with my son coming to work here because I don't think it's safe enough for my son. If it's not safe enough for my son, why is it safe enough for anybody else? It was just this light bulb that went off for him. But, you know, it took a few months of working together for him to be enough in connection with himself to be able to experience that. And we worked on that. Then that became the focus of his work. It's like, who do I need to be as a leader in order to make this a steel plant that I would be happy for my son to come and work in? And he started telling that story to the people in the plant. He went and told them, he said, I realized I wouldn't be happy with this. It's not okay. And, he did a lot of work on himself to look at who do I need to be able to take this group of people and change the way we deal with health and safety around this whole organization so that this changes. And so we worked together on that for about a year or so. That was really when our coaching took off. And then he basically realized one day that it started to shift for him again. And actually what he was concerned about was the local wider community in which he lived. And so he ended up leaving the steel industry and going and working in local government. Kind of the regional government of that particular area that he was working in. And he worked on the economic development of that region. So there is a whole process of getting in touch with, giving life to that part of us that's calling for something. And one of the sort of the fundamental beliefs that I would bring to this work is that each one of us has something that life wants to do through us, that life wants to express through us. Life is wanting to move towards something through each one of us, really. And we develop this personality which inhibits all of that. And we, because we're growing up and we're responding to the events that are around us, to the traumas, to the big traumas, little traumas, whatever they are, whatever's going on around us, we're responding to that. We develop a whole personality, which may or may not give us the capacity for life to achieve what it wants to achieve through us, for us to be able to step into that flow and alignment. And so part of this work then is about how do we bring ourselves back to a place where we can create that sense of alignment, bring those different pieces together. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question though, because you're right. Most people don't arrive with a prepackaged answer to that question. Some do, but most don't. Cool, thank you. Any other questions?
You all have the ability now to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Clark.
I just covered the way to do that.
Hello there. Hi, Pete. This is Raphael. I just wanted to ask you if you could tell me a little bit more about the offer for coaches. I've been trained as an ontological coach. I went through Newfield, and I've gone through the 3-year program with Bob Dunham of Coaching Excellence in Organizations. But I've noticed throughout my practice that the somatic coaching aspect of what I do is pulling me, and it's needed, and it's what's mostly powerful with clients. So I'd love to know a little bit more how the program for coaches looks. Even if I'm a coach already, I want and need to learn about somatic coaching. But if I enroll in a program, how does that look? How does it work?
Okay, so the simple answer is that the somatic coaching program is really designed to bring the capacity to do somatic work in coaching. It's designed to, it's often used by coaches as like a graduate program. It's like, I've done my coaching certificate, which is my degree, and then this is like the graduate, postgraduate degree, the master's or the MBA or whatever equivalent, which is how do I now start to engage with somatic coaching? So it's very much taking these principles, and before you get onto the coaching program, you have to do the level 1 program, which is the one that's coming up in March, because you've got to start with applying this work to yourself before you then start to apply it to other people, so that you see how all of this lives in your body and how it works and plays out. So we start off with that, focus on the self, and then very quickly in the somatic coaching program, we're starting to look at how do you then bring that into your client relationships and apply it, and what does it mean to apply it in different ways. And there are different aspects of somatic coaching that we can get into. So there's some body work that can form part of it. Not all somatic coaches take on the body work component of that, but you'll have some education in that as part of a somatic coaching education, because it's a very powerful way to see bodies and people move through change, move through transformation. So you get some experience in that. You do a lot of work around continuing to deepen your own somatic awareness of yourself, but you're always in that conversation of, and how do I apply this? And how do I bring it into a coaching conversation? How do I start to see my clients and see how their history lives in their bodies? Because, you know, one of the things I said earlier, and I didn't actually make this explicit, if you take the principle that, for example, I talked about the guy who hadn't cried in 30, 40 years, and the way he was a series of muscular contractions that were forming that. If you take that principle out, well, what you can see is that we're holding our personality through our muscular contractions, which means if you're paying attention, you can start to see the way in which people hold their personalities. You can start to see through the contractions the way in which they're holding themselves, and they're holding their histories, they're holding their traumas, all of that stuff, how it's living in the body. The bad news, of course, is that if other people are paying attention to us, they can see that in us, which is, you know, sometimes a little bit more scary. But as a coach, part of what we're looking to do is to develop the capacity to be able to see that in others, and to be able to make good assessments for people in terms of their development. So what I mean by that is, like, we can give somebody a sense of, here's what I see about you. You know, I can see that there's a withdrawal from conflict, or I can see there's an arrogance, or I can see whatever it is. And here's how you do that. Here's how you produce that for yourself, and how you produce that in terms of your identity with other people. And so we do a lot of work around developing the capacity to see that in other bodies, and to be able to then help people go through that process of changing. So how does it that they can start to see when that body starts to shift, and when something different starts to emerge? So we do a lot of work which is really around helping people engage in that kind of conversation with their clients, and help them move through that process. So it's a really it's a lovely program to go through. I think it's a very, very powerful program. The formal structure of it, if you go on the Strozzi Institute website, there's you can see the somatic coaching program. There's a kind of, it'll give you the modules and the kind of the process that it goes through. We're probably going to be launching a European coaching program in, correct me if I'm wrong, Clark, but probably in 2020. No, sorry, 2021.
2021 is what we're looking at.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm still planning for that.
I'm still in 2019, so I was thinking ahead, but no, 2021. So it'll probably be in 2021. And the structure of that might be slightly different. So we may kind of have a different number of modules and different lengths of those, just in terms of we'll be flying someone over from the US for that in order to make that work. But so that program will probably be launched in Europe, as I say, in 2021. But the basic structure of it is available on the US or on the Strozzi Institute website, and you'll be able to find out more information about it. Does that answer your question, or was there a specific question that you had around it that would be helpful?
No, yes, that answers the question. And just a quick follow-up question. If I go through that program, would it be fair to say that that will serve me personally as a coach, and in my public and professional identity also as a leadership consultant that sometimes works with organizations, facilitating workshops, and also with teams, etc.? I mean, it's not just for the one-on-one executive coaching, but it's for bigger systems as well. Would that be fair?
So it's more focused on the one-on-one, but not to the exclusion of the other pieces. But it would have more of a focus on one-on-one coaching, I would say, as a program. Not to the exclusion of other pieces, but that's probably more where it starts, is in the one-to-one conversations.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
But what I'd say is that the taking the abstraction to working with teams, and if you already do team coaching, it would be not a difficult thing to bring in somatic principles into your team coaching based on doing that. That wouldn't be difficult at all.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I just want to say a couple things. about that somatic coaching, because right now it's only available in the United States, but we are in discussions with Strozzi Institute to bring it here in 2021. And Richard Strozzi is one of the people who will come out. We'll get him out here to Barcelona to do it. So you get it from the source, if you will, that training. Also want to say that if it's not clear, but the prerequisite for any of the other advanced courses at Strozzi is the Embodied Leadership 1. Wherever you take it, that's the entry point. You have to get that basic information, that basic knowing. And just as from a coach, because I'm a coach as well, but after the first embodied leadership that I went to, I was able to apply it to my coaching clients immediately. It was like I had new eyes. I had new ways of looking at them, new ways of them being more connected to their bodies, and I had different questions that I was asking them to really get them connected. So it was helpful right away, right after the course.
That's the piece very much that I was referring to earlier, which is that when we do some of this work, we come out with a different way of seeing ourselves and seeing other people and seeing different possibilities for action. And so what shows up as common sense is different to what shows up as common sense before. So it makes a lot of sense to me that, you know, you come out of this and all of a sudden you're starting to ask different questions because just what's showing up to you is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it was
okay. Any other questions?
If you have any questions also about the embodied leadership course that we're going to be doing in Barcelona in March 26th through 29th, not only is the space here for that, if you have questions here, but you can contact us at Greenlight Go, and we're happy to answer any questions you have about location, where it is. You can see that on our website, but you can also get one of our staff members to talk about it. Everybody's been through the program, so yeah, they can really talk about it, their personal experiences.
Yeah.
One of the things you didn't mention, Pete, and I always find it interesting, is about practicing and then people coming to the courses, and you know how challenging it is to take a look at yourself, you know, and why would you spend all this money and all this time, you know, and be uncomfortable. but that's the nature of transforming. You have to be aware of what you're practicing and what the impact is.
There's something about, yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. There's something about part of what I'm selling conceptually here, if you, based on what I've been saying so far, is the first thing is you've got to start getting uncomfortable and spending time being with the discomfort rather than reacting to it and getting away from it and avoiding it. And then the second thing that you have to do is you have to be a beginner and start to learn how to take different actions in the world and be in the world of being less competent rather than being in the world of the things you already know how to do. And so in some ways, this is a little bit of a hard sell. Come and be incompetent and come and be uncomfortable. But the essence of it is that actually, if we really want to move beyond certain things, that's kind of the moves that we need to make. We need to develop the capacity to be with our own discomforts rather than being in reaction to them. And we need to learn to start to take different actions in the world that previously we haven't taken and previously weren't available to us. And the journey of that work, I mean, you know, you talk about it being uncomfortable. You know, I think it is filled with the full spectrum of human emotion, is what I'd say. It's like at times, yes, it's really uncomfortable. At times, it's full of great joy. You know, in my own journey in this work, I've been doing this work since 2002. And one of the things that I realized is that part of what I repressed was joy. I got to have more joy in life. That was lovely. You know, it was like I realized I was containing and holding back all this joy because I grew up in a family where I had an older sister who freaked out every time I expressed great joy and fun and you know, that kind of 12-year-old little boy running around causing 12-year-old boy mayhem. And all of that was kind of repressed. And, you know, I kind of like, oh, I got to experience more joy in life. So, while there is visceral discomfort and there's all sorts of other pieces to this, the range of what we get to experience can be profound and beautiful and can have the full spectrum of human emotions. So I think that's one of the things that I'd say about it is like there's everything that's possible to experience, it's possible to experience there.
All right. Okay. Thanks for that hard sell. I think it's key, and I always appreciated that, and I appreciate you so much, Pete, for the time that you take and the knowledge and the wisdom that you share with us, all of us. It's always very, very refreshing and introspective. I get very introspective listening to you and checking in on myself. So I thank you very much for your commitment to this work.
Thank you very much.
And for being here. And for the rest of you, all of you out there, wherever you are, really appreciate your being here and you're supporting us in our community practices. We will be sending a link out to all the people who signed up, then the people who weren't here, so you can look at it again and maybe new things will come to you. And again, if you have more questions about the upcoming course in Barcelona in March, we're available. Send us an email at info@greenlightgo.es or call us and we'll be happy to talk to you. We really appreciate you guys and hope to see you. And thanks again, Pete.
Well, bye all. Lovely to see you. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.